I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as continued Ukrainian attacks are said to have depleted Russian oil production by the equivalent of 1 million barrels a day, Donald Trump says Putin is unlikely to meet President Zelensky because he doesn't like him. We also hear how the latest coalition of the willing meeting occurred, as China said, with caveats that it might be willing to commit troops to any post-ceasefire force. And we hear how Russian motor racing chiefs have hit the barriers in a spat with Formula One.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in 1 day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 26th of August, 3 years and 185 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor for Defence, Dom Nicholls, and our former Russian correspondent, James Kilner. First, the latest from Dom from the front lines.
Let's go into Ukraine. There have been small advances since Friday. Obviously, we were not live yesterday. It was a public holiday here in the United Kingdom. We're in England and Wales. So it's been a few days. There have been continued small Russian advances. So in the vicinity of Kupiansk, so up in the sort of northeast of the country, about 150 k's east of Kharkiv, the Russian forces that had been pushing in from the east, northeast and north, they've extended around to the west. There's a lozenge poking out from that main front line, if you like. They've got a bit of a lodgement around to the west and northwest of Kupiansk. That's obviously in danger of, if they're able to get around to the south as well, in danger of encircling or bypassing the city there. But Kupiansk has been under extreme pressure for quite a number of months now. That recent move, which was extended over the weekend by Russia, has been a relatively recent development. Also, Russian advances towards Konstantinivka, down in the Donbass, and also in the area kind of far southwest, 50, 60 k's southwest of Pokrovsk, in the vicinity of the Donetsk and Zaporizhia border area there. Ukraine have made some small counterattacks, not going to overplay it, but just because it has happened and it is news. They've pushed a little bit in the vicinity of Sumy, so that Russian lodgement north of Sumy up against the border. Ukraine managed to take back a bit of land there, and also in the area north of Liman, so back in the sort of east of the country. So not a huge amount of movement, but some nonetheless over the weekend. Inside Russian-occupied Luhansk, we are told there's an explosion in occupied Kalinov. We're told it killed 3 Russian air defence troops who were alleged to have been involved in Bucha war crimes and destroyed some equipment there loaded with ammunition. This comes from Ukraine's military intelligence department, HUR. They say that as well as those people killed, there were a number of Russians seriously wounded. We only have their word to go on it. It's very difficult, almost impossible, to verify that and their contention that these individuals were involved in Bucha war crimes. But again, it happened, so we're bringing it to you. The big news really on the sort of battlefield side is the continued attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, which really is seemingly starting to have an effect on Russia more domestically than in terms of the fighting in Ukraine, but it still all adds up to the war. So Ombre Intelligence, the global maritime risk management firm, they say that Ukrainian forces overnight Saturday, Sunday launched a drone attack on the Russian energy infrastructure at Ust-Luga. That's just south down the coast from St. Petersburg. Now, according to the governor of Leningrad Oblast, Alexander Drozdenko, 10 drones were intercepted above the port, but some debris landed on the Novatek terminal, resulting in a fire. Now, Ombre say that according to AIS data, those are the automatic identification system that ships use that show where they are. According to this data, 2 merchant vessels were in the immediate vicinity of the port at the time of the incident. However, as they say again, they often see vessels turning their AIS signals off because they're worried about either being spoofed or being targeted. Hombres say there were more than 10 tankers and gas carriers in the port at the time of the incident. And as of this morning, firefighting teams were still there trying to extinguish the fire. No injuries reported as a result. We very rarely get injury reports from the Russian side, and it's very difficult to tell. Then, continuing these attacks on energy infrastructure, this morning the Kyiv Independent are reporting Ukraine's special ops forces have put out a statement saying that they crippled Russian logistical facilities in occupied Crimea after more reported drone attacks on the occupied peninsula. So the statement by the special ops forces follows reporting by the Crimean Wind Telegram channel that drones had hit a substation at a railway station in the Krasnovodsk town in what they say was a precise hit. They shared footage online of smoke rising above the site and the post-strike sort of imagery. Crimean Wind is a pro-Ukraine Telegram channel. They also reported a strike against railway infrastructure in nearby Jankoy. I think that's on the west, it's near the airbase there, and a possible attack on an oil depot in the same city. Russia's defense ministry say that they had intercepted 8 Ukrainian drones over Crimea early this morning between 7 and 7:30 a.m. local time. They offered no information about damage. These attacks continue the recent trend of Ukraine really going for Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, sometimes at many thousands of kilometre ranges. You may remember that massive fire of the Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery in Rostov Oblast to the east of Ukraine. That was hit last Thursday. The fire was only extinguished yesterday. It was a massive blaze there. You'll see images on social media. Ukraine's military estimates that their long-range strikes have cost Russia nearly $75 billion worth of business, or over 4% of its GDP for 2025. And then yesterday, Reuters, I'm not sort of pouring cold water on Ukraine's military statistics, however, possibly a slightly more accurate report from Reuters yesterday reporting that Ukrainian strikes on 10 Russian oil refineries have disrupted at least 17% of the country's refining capacity, which is equivalent to 1.1 million barrels a day. Now, prices at the pumps in Russia are now around 4 or 5 times that compared to the US, for example. Russians are spending the same. It costs the same for a gallon of gas as in America, but Russia's median salary is only 20% of that in the US. There are reports of fuel rationing across the country, which indicates possible severity of the situation inside Russia. I'm told that below around 75% of capacity, the Russian system will start to be fundamentally damaged, and that will have a consequent knock-on to the economy. Now, disruptions, I'm told, to just a few more Russian refineries could bring this about. A few more need to be put out of action for that situation to arise, but it is fairly close. An indication of how serious this may be for Russia is what we should keep an eye out for. We may see Russian Air Force fighters and bombers taking more risks, trying to shoot down the drones and the cruise missiles, for example, operating further forward than they are. They very, very rarely venture over Ukrainian-held territory for fear of being shot down. They normally stay over either inside Russia or inside Russian-occupied land and lob their kind of glide bombs in from there. But they might try to get closer to shoot down these long-range drones. We may see a ramp-up in Russia's bombing campaign, aimed perhaps more at military sites rather than civilian areas that they normally go for. Anyway, all those things will indicate quite how worried the Kremlin is about these energy strikes. Of course, we should also expect to have the nuclear saber rattling that gets rolled out periodically. So I would expect Medvedev or someone else to come out with a statement very soon, Adélie, warning of the risk of these continued strikes. Not that Russia has stopped striking across the country. There have been repeated strikes over the weekend, bar one day, which I will mention in a moment. But yes, deaths and injuries occurred across the country over the weekend.
So to follow up on these Ukrainian strikes, and apart from the attacks and also all the diplomatic maneuvers that have been going on over the past week, Dom, there are more weapons that are going to be sent to Ukraine. Can you catch me up on who's sending what?
Yeah, more weapon pledges. So Sweden say they've delivered the Airborne Surveillance Command aircraft, their ASC-890, the kind of AWACS equivalent, AWACS being airborne warning and control system, like an air traffic control in the sky, basically. You can see where your things are and you can see what's coming at you as well. So the radars on these Swedish aircraft are said to be able to cover over 500,000 square kilometres in the sort of horizontal plane, if you like. That's what it can see from where the jet is, up to about 50,000 feet. Now, over the sea, and even though we think the big blue wobbly stuff isn't particularly flat, compared to land where there's buildings and trees and valleys and all the rest of it, the sea, for sort of military terms, should be considered flat. So over the sea, the system can detect and track fighter jets, helicopters, hovering, cruise missiles, even naval targets as small as jet skis. Now, that wouldn't be possible over the land for all the reasons I said, the ground clutter. But that's to give you an idea of what this thing can do if it was on a billiard table, for example. Not that there's many billiard tables at sea, but you know what I'm talking about. Now, the defence ministers of Ukraine and Sweden also agreed on joint production of defence equipment, so another bilateral defence deal going on there. We're also told over the weekend that Norway and Germany are going to jointly fund 2 Patriot air defence systems with missiles for Ukraine. And then over the weekend also there was a report from the Wall Street Journal saying that the US is going to be sending 3,350, very specific, ERAMs. These are the extended range attack munition to Ukraine. These are air-launched missiles. We're told delivery is due to start in weeks. Essentially low-cost cruise missiles, if you like, with a range of about 250 miles, so not the thousands of kilometres that we've been seeing some of these strikes, but, you know, better in our pocket than theirs kind of thing. It's got a CEP of less than 10 metres. CEP, you'll remember, is, come on, we've done this lesson, circular error probable, or circular error of probability. If you draw a circle around a target, and the radius, the CEP is the radius. So this is 10 metres. So draw a circle around a target of 10 metre radius. That is where 50% of these munitions will land. It's a metric of accuracy. So a CEP, really accurate stuff, is down in the sort of 3, 4, 5 metres CEP. Older kit, these Kinzhal ballistic missiles, for example, are in the hundreds of metres. And don't forget that that's where 50% of the munitions will land. That still gets the tick in the precision munition box. Now, the other 50% might land just a couple of metres outside that CEP or hundreds of metres, kilometres, etc., etc. So that's why you sometimes get munitions going way off target and still being described as precision. It was a precision attack. Strike. Yeah, the weapon either for some reason malfunctioned or was functioning correctly, and just for all these reasons, it fell outside of its CEP. Anyway, these things, the ERAMs, with a CEP of 10 metres, makes it a very precise weapon.
I've definitely failed my back-to-school pop quiz here, but I'll brush up on my acronyms, promise.
Now, we know, Ukraine's been looking for a low-cost, kind of light warhead. This thing's a warhead of 500 pounds. That's big, but it's not super big. They're looking for this precision munition for a long time, something that can manoeuvre, so is largely jam resistant. If it's just parabolic, if you just bung it in the air and then it's physics where it lands, an air defence system can work out where it's going to go and shoot it down. But something that has some manoeuvrability and can therefore move on its way to the target, even if it's not under power, but we think these things are. So a glide bomb, for example, is not under power, but it can manoeuvre, so in some way it's very difficult to intercept. So Ukraine's been looking for something of this type of weapon for a long time. I hear, though, these are going to be priced at about $60,000 per round, per munition. Just the seeker heads alone and the turbofan, or whatever the power is, should put it above that price. So I'm wondering if either the US has reduced its price or done Ukraine a favour. I think we know the answer to that. Or some capability might have been traded out of these things. But anyway, the top line is that there's 3,000 ERAMs on their way to Ukraine from the US, but quite what they're going to look like, we don't know yet.
And so over the weekend, there have been comments and talks about a potential ceasefire and whether we're inching towards that. I know we've all been waiting for a long time for that, and the deadline keeps on being postponed. But what have you been hearing, Dom?
Yeah, so, chat about deadlines and ceasefires and what's going to happen in 2 weeks, it rumbles on. There has been more chat about the size and shape of what this coalition of the willing or any post-ceasefire force, implementation force, a stabilisation force, a thingy force might look like. So we hear that China is ready to send troops to Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire, but only if there's a UN mandate. This comes from German media outlet Welt. Now, a senior EU diplomat close to ongoing discussions about what any post-ceasefire force might look like told Welt, quote, "There is also a danger that China primarily wants to spy on Ukraine and, in the event of a conflict, will take a clearly pro-Russian position instead of a neutral position." Now, that fear is a legitimate fear, fair enough, but that needs to be balanced against the idea that any coalition of countries or any grouping of countries, I don't think China would want to be included in anything that had the term coalition in it, but any grouping of countries that includes nations that doesn't come from Ukraine's traditional Western partners, that might be more acceptable. So that might inch towards a deal more easily than if it was just kind of Westerners. But, the whole thing about needs to come with a UN mandate. The long pole in the tent there, of course, is the veto power of the P5, China and Russia, obviously on the P5. So it's interesting that China says this, but as ever, it's actions rather than words when we'll really get excited. But there's been a lot more chat about the coalition of the willing, or whatever it's going to be, over the weekend. So during a visit to Kyiv, where he met Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky on Sunday, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, he's been making a few comments. So firstly, he announced over $1 billion Canadian worth in aid for Ukraine, said to be drones, ammunition, armoured vehicles, all that kind of stuff starting to be delivered from next month. But then he was talking about this post-ceasefire force. He said, "In Canada's judgment, it is not realistic that the only security guarantee could be the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces. That needs to be buttressed and reinforced. We are working through, with our allies in the coalition of the willing and with Ukraine, the modalities of those security guarantees on land, in the air and the sea, and I would not exclude the presence of troops." So a little bit wordy. I mean, he's an economist by background. Anyone that starts talking about modalities of guarantees, probably has a financial background. But, that's a big old number, $1 billion Canadian. So Canada and Mark Carney arguably stronger than his predecessor, Mr. Trudeau. But on the coalition of the willing continuing, there was a virtual meeting yesterday, co-chaired by Britain's Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Tony Radakin, co-chaired with the French. The coalition of the willing at the moment is a joint Anglo-French sort of led thing. But I'm told there were at least 30 other nations involved in that virtual meeting, including Canada. And just to finish on that, Mark Carney said that Canada is going to be furthering their work on the Children's Return Coalition, that effort to bring more, hopefully all, the Ukrainian children home.
Well, that is good to hear. I do, before we move on, have a question about China, though. I thought China had said repeatedly that they were very keen for the war in Ukraine to continue so that no one would really pay attention to the Pacific, and especially not the US. Do you think saying they will send peacekeeper troops, is that just paying lip service to the UN and the general sort of music at the moment?
Well, I don't know if it's lip service. It's almost out of Putin's playbook. On the face of it, it sounds really helpful. And then when you look at it a little bit further, it's arguably quite the opposite. I mean, it could be a coded message to Russia to say, come on, chum, you need to start shifting towards some form of ceasefire deal. Those fears of China spying on Ukraine might be a little overblown, but I don't think Putin would be massively upset if there were Chinese troops included in whatever this force looks like, because they would be, I would imagine, more predisposed to being soft on Russia's position. So I think this is, rather than a message to the West and say don't look at the Indo-Pacific and Taiwan and all the rest of it, I would interpret this as more of a message to Putin to say, look, we have got your back. We've been doing a lot of stuff with oil over the years. We've been selling a lot of dual purpose goods that you've been able to use in your missiles and all the rest of it. But we're now talking about actual troops, but you need to start shuffling towards that ceasefire deal, I think. Thoughts welcome.
Okay, I see. I'll have a think about that. Sunday was Ukraine's Independence Day. How was it marked and what happened?
Yeah, President Zelensky, responding to a message from King Charles, said the king was a true inspiration. So in a message posted on social media on Sunday, the king had spoken of his greatest and deepest admiration for the Ukrainian people and called for a just and lasting peace. Now, Mr. Zelensky, who was in his national dress during a press conference in Kyiv, responded by posting, "His Majesty's kind words are a true inspiration for our people during the difficult time of war. We appreciate the United Kingdom's leadership in supporting Ukraine and our just cause to defend freedom from tyranny and ensure a lasting peace in Ukraine and throughout Europe. Now, all very nice. The government here, government buildings were flying the Ukrainian flag, and the MOD here announced the extension of Operation Interflex. You'll remember that's the training pipeline. Britain's trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops. That's been extended until the end of 2026. Now, these Independence Day celebrations in Kyiv were also attended by Keith Kellogg, the US Special Envoy for Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky gave Mr. Kellogg a state honour, presenting him with the Order of Merit medal. Mr. Kellogg apparently told President Zelensky, "We're going to make this work," whatever that means. Mr. Kellogg, by the way, has been dubbed by locals in Ukraine as the patron saint of Kyiv, because apparently whenever he's there in the capital, there are no missile strikes. And that happened on Sunday. There were strikes across the rest of the country, but no missile strikes against Kyiv. Now, coincidence or causality, I do not know, but he's known by some as the patron saint of Kyiv. There you go. So this was when Mark Carney was in town, saying all the stuff that we just mentioned about weapons and all the rest of it. But next to Mr. Carney, President Zelensky said Ukraine has not yet won, but it has certainly not lost the war. He described Ukraine not as a victim, but as a fighter. It was in the context of that, the report of the Ust-Luga strike up in just west of St. Petersburg, and also another strike that was said to have taken place in Kursk. Now, he did say, again, he's reiterated it, President Zelensky did say that he was willing to meet Vladimir Putin. He said he's ready to meet him on a one-to-one, saying that that would be the most effective way forward. Why do they not have a date? Well, Donald Trump's got the answer to that. He said that Putin is reluctant to meet Zelensky because, quote, he doesn't like him. I think we knew that anyway. I mean, so you'll remember in Alaska for that very brief press conference that I was at, only about 8 or 9 minutes long, the big do-out from that was apparently this bilateral meeting that was going to take place between Zelensky and Putin, followed by a trilat when Donald Trump would get involved. But obviously, since then, Putin, what they do, they agree to it. Oh, we'd love to do it. If only there's these couple of little points we could clear up first. And so quick as a flash, nothing's happened. Sergei Lavrov on Sunday said that there needs to be an agenda before the two leaders meet. I mean, I think we know what the agenda is, and it's not like the Russians not to have an agenda. I mean, there's always an agenda with them. So, it's just Stally McStallface. Mr. Trump asked why he thinks Putin is so averse to meeting President Zelensky. He said because he doesn't like him. They don't like each other, really. I don't know if they'll meet. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. They do not exactly get along well. Okay. Trump said he had spoken to Putin since the call last Monday after all the Euro leaders and Zelensky were in the White House. He said, every conversation I have with him, that's Putin, is a good conversation. And then, unfortunately, a bomb is loaded up into Kyiv or someplace, and then I get very angry about it. He still thinks a deal might be possible. He says, I think we're going to get the war done and stuff. Of the 7 that I settled, I thought that would be the easiest of the group. So regardless of what you think about the maths, last week he was saying he had solved 6 wars in the 6 months he's been president. He's now saying 7. Of the 7 that I settled, I thought that would be the easiest of the group. So what is this? I don't know what the other number 7 is, unless he's including Russia-Ukraine, which clearly is not settled. Anyway, I don't put much stock in these words. I report them to you because they have happened, and it's the President of the United States saying it. However, what he did do that might be more accurate, he gave a few details about the role the US might play in any future security package for Ukraine. He has ruled out sending US troops if any ceasefire or peace deal is agreed, but he said the Air Force could help police the skies. So yesterday, he said that whilst we don't know any specifics of the deal, America provide backup to Ukraine and Europe. He said Europe is going to give them significant security guarantees, and they should because they're right there, but we'll be involved from the standpoint of backup to help them. And I think if we get a deal, and I think we will, but if we get a deal, I don't believe you're going to have much of a problem, but we'll back it up because I want to stop seeing people being killed. Yeah, fine. I mean, as I said last week, I'm very nervous. I mean, a guarantee is pretty black or white. It's a binary. It's 1 or a 0. It's a guarantee or it's not. So until we actually see what this thing is, talking about a guarantee, I think, is premature. And now a backup for a guarantee that may or may not exist, it's all a bit wishy-washy. Anyway, that's what he said. Whether it pushes the debate on, I do not know. He did, however, say that the US is no longer dealing directly with Ukraine over military aid. He said, "We deal with NATO. We don't deal with Ukraine. NATO requests missiles. They want Patriots. They want missiles. We give the missiles to NATO. NATO pays us in full and does what they want." Apparently, I didn't know this. I've got to start calling him the President of Europe. He says that people over here are calling him the President of Europe because he's so respected. "They call me the President of Europe, which is an honour. I like Europe and I like those people. They're good people. They're great leaders."
I'd love
So
to
there we
know
go.
who he's been speaking to about this.
Yeah. If anyone's been calling Donald Trump the President of Europe, let us know. And just finally, from the White House, you should know, Adélie, so a wide-ranging interview yesterday. J.D. Vance, the Vice President, he cited a number of concessions that he says have shown that the Kremlin is serious about ending the war. Whether or not they are real or just intended to hoodwink the White House, he gave a bit of a cryptic answer. But he said on Putin's apparent compromises, nothing had been offered by Moscow in the last 3.5 years of fighting, and they were only made possible by Mr. Trump. He still didn't say what they were. He said, "I think the Russians have made significant concessions to President Trump for the first time in 3.5 years of conflict." He was speaking to NBC's Meet the Press Sunday night. J.D. Vance said, "I didn't say they conceded on everything, but what they have conceded is the recognition that Ukraine will have territorial integrity after the war." I'm not sure they have, to be perfectly honest. He carried on. He said, "They recognise that they're not going to be able to install a puppet regime in Kyiv." I think Putin very definitely has that desire. Vance finishes, he says, "And importantly, they've acknowledged that there is going to be some security guarantee to the territorial integrity of Ukraine." I really don't think Russia has. Well, they said they might be open to that as long as they had a veto on it. So the direction of travel is clear, even if the detail of what they say just muddies the water. But I don't see any desire to get Putin to this bilateral meeting with Zelensky. I don't see any consequences for not agreeing to a ceasefire. Or maybe we've got another 2-week rolling, God knows what. I don't know. Not hugely encouraging messages from the US administration over the weekend.
No, I feel like if Putin had agreed to all three things that J.D. Vance said, it would be a massive walk away from all of the maximalist demands he's made over the last few months. And they would be able to talk about a ceasefire, which they aren't. And why would he be scared to meet Zelensky? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
There's a last battlefront that you need to catch us up on. Dom, our cultural expert.
Yeah, well, I wasn't told by the regular commissions board that I was a cultural desert for nothing. So here we go. I'm going to dip my toe into the world of opera. And I would point folk, we will put a link in the episode notes, point folk to an article by our correspondent Liam Kelly, who says the Royal Opera here in London is bracing itself for a backlash because they are planning to host Anna Netrebko, who's the Russian soprano, previously honoured by Vladimir Putin. She's turning up. She's going to be in forthcoming productions of Tosca and Turandot. Netrebko, 53 years old. She's widely regarded as the greatest female opera singer of her generation. She's even been called opera's answer to Beyoncé, with over 700,000 Instagram followers, a tad under Frances Durnley.
I mean, if you've seen Frances doing karaoke, you've basically seen Beyoncé, haven't you?
It is a sight to behold. Could power the grid if we wired him up. Anyway, her performances have been cancelled in America, Italy, Switzerland, Germany. This is amid a wider boycott of Russian artists with links to the Kremlin. But she has attended other invitations. The diary has been reduced, but she has sung in the State Opera House in Vienna. She lives there. She's also sung at La Scala in Milan, where her performances have largely passed without incident, although there have been some protests, to be fair. So the Royal Opera's decision here to book Ms. Netrebko, a woman who has described Putin as a very attractive man and praised his strong male energy, nevertheless caused outrage, as you'd expect, among some. There's an open letter that's been written calling for the Royal Opera House to reverse that decision. That letter was organised by Sergei Kilitsia, who's Ukraine's first deputy foreign minister, and John Whittingdale, former Conservative Culture Secretary. Signed by scores of writers, artists, culture cross-party MPs here. Now, she's not returned to Russia since February 22. She has given a number of interviews. She gave an interview to Germany's Die Zeit in 2022 when she said she would not criticise Putin. She said, "No one in Russia can. Putin is still the president of Russia. I'm still a Russian citizen, so you can't do something like that. Do you understand?" So I declined to make such a statement. She's also spoken to Le Monde, the French newspaper. She said that she did not vote in the 2018 Russian election. She's not directly addressed the war or Putin since 2022. There's going to be more backlash to her appearance here in London if it goes ahead. And for much more on this on that story, do check out Liam Kelly's article, to which we will link. The second culture war, if you like, which is on firmer territory for me. Russia's motor racing chiefs are suing Formula One for 50 million pounds sterling here in London in the High Court after Formula One scrapped the races that they were supposed to, or they had agreed to run in Russia. This is obviously since 2022. Now, the Russian Grand Prix ran between 2014 and 2021 at a purpose-built circuit in Sochi on the Black Sea coast. It was set to move to the new Igora Drive Arena in St. Petersburg in 2023, but Stefano Dominic, the sport's boss, insisted in the wake of the full-scale invasion that Formula One would never return. He said at the time there will be no more racing in Russia. Anyway, that didn't go down well with the Kremlin-backed promoter ANO Rosgonki, headed by Alexei Titov. They're now demanding money. They're demanding their money back, I guess, for the development of the other circuit. They've come to London's High Court in an attempt to claw back these millions of hosting fees. They're suing for breach of contract. They say Russia has paid around £50 million to host the annual race, and Titov said that's got to be refunded in full plus interest. He's accused Formula One of using politics to mask what he called this breach of contract. He said the debt exists, it is confirmed, and our position on it is unchanged. And speaking to Russian state media, he said, we expect a refund regardless of Formula One's current position. Dominic words carry a political connotation that has nothing to do with the real spirit of sport. You may remember Formula One cancelled that 2022 Sochi race only weeks before it was due to take place, directly citing the full-scale invasion. Then Mr. Dominic later doubled down, said we will no longer negotiate with them. Titov's claim that Formula One had agreed to repay the fees, but that Western sanctions have blocked the transfers. He said their position is that they would be happy to return it, the money, but we're all under sanctions. Transfers are closed, so you have to wait. So Formula One wading in as well, and so far sticking to their guns or whatever you're having. I suppose you don't have guns, be a bit dangerous, but anyway. Yes, and that's us up to date from quite a hectic weekend.
And now on the podcast, we've got James Kilner joining us, our former Russia correspondent and specialist on the Caucasus and Central Asia, and Russia, of course. James, welcome. You've been scouring the headlines for us in Russian newspapers and Russian news. What is the reading of what happened at the Alaska summit and sort of behind the scenes, aside from the conversations on Ukraine?
In Russian newspapers, what you won't find is often as important as what you do find. So what you won't find in the media is any reference to a Zelensky-Putin get-together. I know it's been written about a lot in the West and probably in Ukraine, but in Russia it's not been discussed. Your reference to what was happening on the sidelines of the Alaska summit, Reuters has been doing some very interesting reporting, which I think came out this morning. It's been reporting that US and Russian officials on the sidelines of this Alaska summit, obviously the big show was Trump and Putin, but on the sidelines of this summit, officials were discussing the potential of ExxonMobil, a massive US energy company, joining the Sakhalin oil and gas project in Russia's Far East. This is one of Russia's biggest, if not the biggest, oil and gas project, very important for its supplies to China. Well, it's completely remarkable that these discussions are even happening, in a sense that it shows how far down the line Russia and the US are for, making business transactions. I think it's very clear that Trump sees his whole negotiation tactics and systems with Russia as a potential business deal. Like I said, Reuters was just reporting it this morning. It hasn't been fully confirmed. That is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. At the same time also, Russian media started discussing the potential for Boeing, the US airplane manufacturer, restarting a joint venture that it had with a Russian company, pulled out of in 2022. It started with a factory in the Urals producing titanium parts for passenger jets. The factory hasn't been able to operate since then. We know the Russian aviation sector is really lacking spare parts for its planes. Clearly, the Kremlin sees this as an important joint venture that it wants to see back or up and running. The overtone of this is, again, business first. I can't stress enough how surprising, maybe not surprising, because we know that Trump is a business-first guy, but how much of a shift this is to start talking about US-Russian companies working together on business deals again in Russia.
Well, it sounds like it's full on. I mean, we've talked a lot on this podcast about the normalization of US-Russia relations, but that's taking it even further. It's a real implementation, but also it's going against any sense of sanctions that have been going on since the invasion. So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it's making the sanctions completely inefficient if Russia is actually getting business deals out of beginning of conversations around a potential ceasefire, let alone peace agreement with Ukraine mediated by Trump.
Absolutely. I mean, this is prioritising business over the plight of the Ukrainians in many ways. And it's also signalling, I think, very strongly that Western business should start preparing to re-enter, because most Western business left Russia in 2022. But this is signalling to them, I think, that they should be preparing to re-enter, which is a very important nuance to that story. You know, if they're talking about Boeing and ExxonMobil doing business in Russia again, then why not all these other companies as well?
The second item I think that you wanted to talk about is some of Russia's allies, and namely Iran. There have been some big revelations in the Russian media lately. What are those? Yeah,
very, very interesting story, this, Adélie. It's come straight out of the Russian media, this one. I'm not even sure I've seen it reported in English yet, but a senior government member in Iran went on record to say that the Kremlin, or Russia, was giving the coordinates of Iranian air defense systems to the Israeli military during the 12-day war in June.
That's mad.
Yeah, to put it into context, Iran and Russia signed something called a strategic alliance or strategic pact earlier this year, which was meant to show to the world what great allies Russia and Iran are. As your listeners know, they're separated by the Caspian Sea, which has become something of a missile superhighway in the war in Ukraine, with Iran sending certainly thousands of deadly Shahed drones and certainly hundreds, possibly thousands of missiles across the Caspian Sea to help out the Kremlin. And then they signed this strategic alliance at the beginning of the year. There's a 12-day war, Israel-US war against Iran. The world was waiting, to some extent, to see how Russia acted. And it ostensibly did nothing. Now, we're hearing from the Iranians that they didn't do nothing. They actually went over to the other side. They went and backed up the Israelis, which is a remarkable thing. So I remember talking about this on the podcast at the time. It was quite clear that by doing nothing, or seemingly doing nothing, the Kremlin was trying to repair damaged relations with Israel. Israeli-Russian relations have been badly dented around the Ukraine war and perceptions and attitudes towards it. Netanyahu and Putin at one stage did have very close relations, and that's fractured. So it seemed to me at the time that Putin had decided that his alliance with Iran was far less valuable now than it was, say, a year or two ago. Now they're getting missiles from North Korea. The rights to produce their own Shahed drones effectively from Iran. And they've got this huge factory up in Kazan which is pumping them out. So it doesn't need Iran for its missiles anymore. It doesn't need Iran for its drones. And it increasingly seems Putin used that war to repair relations with Israel, going so far as this Iranian official alleges, and there's been no official comment on this from the Kremlin, to actually give away the coordinates of Iranian air defense systems to the Israeli military, which is quite a story.
Yeah, that's really big. Do you think that could lead to bigger falling out between the two countries, and what would that look like?
I mean, if that story is stood up, if the Iranians stick with that story, I don't see how it can't. It's very difficult to envisage bilateral relations between Iran and Russia being severely damaged. From the Western point of view, from the Ukrainian point of view, it has to be a positive. It's unclear, actually, whether Iran has even been supplying Russia with missiles and drones since the 12-day war in June. There was a story in the Russian media, I think in July, when an Iranian bank, state-linked bank, was trying to buy Russia's biggest port on the Caspian Sea. So that does give an indication that they had longer-term intentions for these relations. Whether or not they can survive this sort of allegation is another thing.
Looking to the west of Iran now, to Armenia and Azerbaijan, you told me that there were some Kremlin maneuvering going on since the peace deal had been signed between the two countries. What has been going on?
Armenia and Azerbaijan signed a peace deal in Washington earlier this month with Trump lording over it. And the peace deal ostensibly ended 3 decades of war, three and a half decades of war, and required the US taking control of a land corridor between the Azerbaijani mainland and an Azerbaijani exclave called Nakhchivan, the other side of Armenia. So the land corridor runs about 42 kilometres across Armenia. This was part of the deal, and this was the big sticking point. That land corridor actually runs parallel to Armenia's border with Iran and has caused lots of problems for the Iranians. Anyway, the point is that peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia has pulled both countries further into the West's sphere of influence and away from the Kremlin. The Kremlin is very annoyed about this. Armenia had accused the Kremlin of not doing enough to back it up against Azerbaijani aggression. Russian air defense systems shot down an Azerbaijani airliner on Christmas Day, killing 36 people. Really annoying Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev, who up until that point had been very staunch Russian ally, really. Since then, he's completely fallen out and has promised to supply Ukraine with gas, etc. That's the context. The Kremlin has been worrying about this and has openly said that it's going to mount an influence campaign to try and keep Armenia from joining the EU, which Armenian President Nicholls has said he wants to do. So within Armenia at the moment, a major pro-Russian oligarch billionaire, one of Armenia's richest men, has been arrested. Prime Minister has also accused the church of being treacherous, lying to the people. The church in Armenia is very pro-Russian. So Russian institutions and business is under huge attack in Armenia, and the Kremlin is worried. Up pops this guy, Alexei Overchuk, who's the Russian deputy prime minister. He was in Armenia in Yerevan last Wednesday, talking to Pashinyan and other senior government members. Ostensibly, this was just a bilateral trip, standard trip sort of thing. That's how it's presented. In reality, and as reported by the Armenian media, not so much the Russian media, but the Armenian media, what was going on was the Russians were trying to get an inside track on this peace deal in Washington. They are very concerned about what it potentially looks like having US control of this land corridor. Does that mean some sort of US troops in Armenia, or does this just mean US tech or looking after it, or whatever it means? So Overchuk was down there quizzing his Armenian counterparts about that. No doubt also pressuring in that Kremlin way with promises and threats to try to stop Armenia shifting further towards the EU. Also last week, Overchuk was, he's been busy. He's been given this problem to sort out for the Kremlin. He does pop up and down in the South Caucasus. He was also hosting a bilateral summit with Azerbaijani government members in Astrakhan, the Russian port on the Caspian Sea. Although this wasn't at the highest level, the problems, the breakdown in relations between Azerbaijan and Russia have caused the Kremlin have been very significant. And they will be scrambling very hard to try and repair it. And I get the sense that Overchuk has been given this as a project. Keep a close eye on what he's up to in that region.
And I think what's really interesting that you've mentioned is it all also stems from wanting to prevent Armenia to join the EU and trying to control what is being said about this. It's almost a very similar playbook to what's happened in Ukraine, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, it's not Ukraine. Ukraine is a special place in the Kremlin's psyche. But they get very, very edgy when countries in the former Soviet Union try and shift westward. I mean, Georgia's a very good example. Obviously, borders Armenia and Azerbaijan. Mikhail Saakashvili was trying to shift Georgia's orientation 20 years ago. He ran up against a very hardcore Kremlin program to stop that happening. For Armenia to be looking to actually be openly talking about joining the EU is remarkable. It's a total red flag for the Kremlin, and I think we're going to see a lot of hustle and bustle in that region.
The last story you want to talk to us about, you're taking us back into Russia and back into some Russian factories, drone factories, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Adélie. So this is Kazan. If you remember, I was in Kazan in October for the BRICS summit. This is a sort of, meant to be an alternative anti-Western economic group that Russia was really trying to pump up. It actually failed to do that. But one of its founding members, of the BRICS founding members, BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So one of them was South Africa. It's now emerged that South African government is investigating allegations that the Kremlin has used a group linked to BRICS to lure young South African women to their drone factories in Kazan. So this BRICS group has been advertising jobs for $800 a month on construction sites in Russia. A lot of money for a lot of these poor South African women. But when they get to Russia, according to reports, 90% of them end up manufacturing drones for Russia's war in Ukraine. And they don't get paid the full salary either. So not only are they doing a different job, but they're also doing a job which is very, very war-related job for a country that they've got no real links to. Potential war crime. Luring foreign nationals on false promises into your war machine is a very serious allegation.
Thank you very much, James. Just going to final thoughts now. Dom is off the hook because he had to go, but James, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Just one, Adélie. There's been a really interesting sideshow going on in the Kremlin, and this focuses on a prominent former Kremlin speechwriter. He's one of their top propagandists. He's a guy called Sergei Markov. He's used by the Kremlin to explain their policies, especially to the West. He speaks English, and you can often hear him on TV and radio. And he's very prolific, writing in Russian on Telegram, the Russian social messaging channel, about what the Kremlin is doing and explaining it for the Kremlin. And he considers himself a Kremlin insider, a nationalist, a pro-war, pro-Putin nationalist. He seemed to be doing everything correctly, but he made a fatal error, which has now got him the foreign agent tag, which is something that the Kremlin slaps on people who have been naughty. Being labelled foreign agent doesn't mean you go to prison, but it means that you're heavily scrutinised. You have to label all your messages foreign agent. You become much harder to hire and sort of much less valuable, and it's just more difficult to do your job. So he's been labelled a foreign agent. It took everyone by surprise. And where he went wrong is that he was a lobbyist for Azerbaijan. As I've already said, Azerbaijan-Russian relations have collapsed. He was caught out. He was in a conference in Azerbaijan praising Ilham Aliyev, the Azerbaijani president, as a political genius. Consistently be doing the sort of pro-Azerbaijan line, not anti-Russia line, but bigging up Azerbaijan. It transpired that he was in the pay of Azerbaijan to some extent, and he was talking up his client. Now, the interesting thing is here, the Russian mill bloggers, the sort of group of military enthusiasts online who pump out Kremlin propaganda, the more mainstream Kremlin propagandists on the big talk shows, they've been enraged by this. And they went after Markov, and they started calling for the Kremlin to slap this foreign agent label on him. And the Kremlin has done that. Markov has reacted in anger, all this sort of thing. I mean, we've seen this before, but not on this high level, this sort of fracturing of the coalition of the pro-Kremlin hardcore propagandists that the Kremlin relies on so much to pump out its message. So we're seeing that in real time. We're also seeing another implication result of this collapse in Azerbaijan-Russia relations, which I keep banging on about, but it is so important, and it's starting to catch insiders out. And we're also seeing just how difficult it is, even for people who have spent their careers on the inside, to work out the shifting contours of the policy, the dynamics of Russian diplomatic outreach, etc. Because things are happening so fast that the Kremlin is sort of, in often cases, just caught flat-footed, and it's sort of hanger-oners, and Markov is one of them, get caught out.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.